It's time to sit back, relax, and listen to Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life will inspire, motivate, and empower you. Live your best life now. Listen, learn, think, and decide. Change your attitude, change your life. And now, here's your host, Joan Herman.
Welcome to Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. You're listening to us in your neighborhood from coast to coast and around the world. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Joan Herman, author, speaker, and your host. Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life brings you interviews with some of the most inspirational and influential people in the world. It's our goal to educate and empower you so you can live your best life now. Thank you for taking time for yourself, and thank you for letting us be a part of your life. We have another great show for you today. Joining me is Jennie Kramer, who's here to talk about overcoming binge eating. Jennie offers practical solutions to overcome urges to binge, and she explains how to stay motivated for lasting and effective change. Jennie is the founder and executive director of Metro Behavioral Health Associates Eating Disorder Treatment Centers and is the co-author of the new book, Overcoming Binge Eating for Dummies. Welcome, Jennie. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Joan. Thanks for having me.
Jennie, when we talk about binge eating, I think a lot of times people, they think of anorexia or they think of something that's very dramatic. Is that what binge eating is?
It's pretty dramatic, and I think it's useful to talk about it in a distinguished way. So let's say there's a difference between what we think is binge eating and compulsive overeating and emotional eating. So if you're someone who sort of grazes all day and you have no sense of portion control and you just keep eating regardless of hunger cues or satiety cues, that's what we tend to call compulsive overeating. It's very compelling, but it's not quite binge eating, as you'll see in just a second. Emotional eating, we can all figure out. You're having a bad day, you're having a reaction to something, you're avoiding something, procrastinating, upset, anxiety, whatever it may be. And so you're eating clearly having nothing to do with any physical hunger cues. We tend to call that emotional eating. Binge eating, on the other hand, may encompass those, but it's quite serious because it is intake of many thousands of calories in a particular period of time, be it a 30-minute, 60-minute, could be 4 hours, could be all day. And you can imagine all of the effects that has both on the psyche and on the body when you take in that much food at a time.
Jennie, what are some of those health risks associated with binge eating?
Well, for sure. I mean, on a physical end, one is much more subject to obesity and all that goes with it, although not all binge eaters are overweight, and this is one of the biggest myths about binge eaters. Certainly, one can develop diabetes, liver disease from all of the intake of all the fat in one sitting. One can also develop, bone and joint issues if, in fact, obesity results, blood sugar fluctuations, headaches, mood swings, real depression, worsened anxiety, just to name a few.
Jennie, what are the causes of binge eating?
It's sort of like asking what's the cause of an eating disorder in general, like anorexia or bulimia. They are multifactorial. Certainly, it is a psychological disorder. In fact, just this May of 2013, it is finally included in the DSM-5 as a verifiable diagnosis. That's binge eating disorder. And so like all eating disorders, they are partly psychological, partly inheritable, partly environmental, all based on perception of one's world and one's environment. There's usually a mood disorder that goes with that, be it anxiety, depression, or other things. So there's many, many causes. In its essence, it's a way of self-soothing with food, the way one might self-soothe with alcohol, the way one might self-soothe with drugs. And so there's a big controversy about whether an eating disorder is addictive at all, and our position is that it is.
Now, often when we think about binge eaters, I think we tend to associate it with younger girls, but who are the people that are predominantly impacted by this disorder?
It's an interesting question, Joan. Binge eating is across all ages, but there's a big, big sector of both men and women between the ages of about 35 and 55 or 60. So you can imagine that while, again, there's every age affected, that bulk, I think, has to do with just an accumulation of life and mood changes and all of the life adjustments we must all make, but also there are shifts in metabolism that occur. And so, for instance, if you take a guy who's 40 and he was always athletic in school and he ate like an athlete and he never thought about it twice, and now suddenly he's under a lot of stress at work and he has a family to take care of, and suddenly he's much more sedentary and he has some life events occurring around him, maybe the loss of a parent, maybe the breakup of a marriage, whatever it may be, and suddenly he's left with no ability to cope, and so he goes to the thing that he knows the best, the thing he knows the most, which is food. And so that starts the emotional eating, and then the binge eating, simply because one has many, many, many more hours at a time available and really just feels that there's an empty hole that can't be filled.
So binge eating usually starts out with an emotional eating and then it progresses?
I believe so. I really do. I don't think someone just wakes up one day and decides, I think I'm going to eat enough for 12 people today. I really do think it starts that way. And, there's a lot of shame associated with it because it's done in secret. It can be done, in one's bedroom, in the kitchen. It can be done in the car. Often it's done outside of the house, on the way to somewhere, walking to somewhere. They pick up all the binge foods or driving somewhere. And so it becomes a self-perpetuating problem. If you are ashamed of it, if you're ashamed of your body, if you don't like that you do this, you tend to do it more just to turn off those unpleasant feelings.
Jennie, so many of us, I believe, are emotional eaters. So how do we know when we've crossed over from emotional eating to a much more serious problem?
I think it's a wonderful question, John. I think it has to do with frequency, and it has to do with the amount of food being eaten. So if you're someone like most of us who, again, once in a while has a bad day, or once in a while just can't deal with certain things, and you notice, I know I'm not hungry, but I'm eating anyway. I don't know why I'm doing that. That's certainly compelling and serious enough. Binge eating is really when you find yourself doing it almost every day, and again, this massive intake within a relatively short period of time. We talk about thousands of calories. Well, certainly if someone's compulsive overeating and, sort of grazing all day, they could take in the equivalent calories if that's how we're measuring it. But it's the act of taking it all in sort of at once. And again, binge eaters can do this multiple times a day. They can eat literally enough for 2 or 3 meals in a meal and do that 4 or 5 times a day. So it's really based on frequency, and it's really based on the literal amount of food being eaten.
Does purging usually follow a binge?
Well, that's a different eating disorder. It's called bulimia, and people who purge often purge after a binge. Binge eaters who are not bulimics wish they were bulimic because they wish they could undo some of the damage. Of course, they don't know what they're wishing for because purging is altogether another matter and very serious and has other serious side effects. There are people who don't know they're purging, and what I mean by that is they're not vomiting or using laxatives, but they're exercising to compensate, they think, for all the binging that's taking place. And so that we call exercise bulimia. But pure binge eaters don't do compensatory behaviors to make up for what they've binged on. They just stop either because they literally pass out, or they stop because they're just so tired, or they stop because they're experiencing physical pain. And that's actually another interesting indicator. People who are bingers really only stop because their bodies stop them. They're literally in physical pain. An emotional eater is a little different.
Jennie, in your book, you talk about some of the myths of binge eaters, and we may have covered a few in this interview already, but I think that these are very important. Can we just go through a couple of the more important ones?
Sure. I think one of the biggest ones, as we talked about, is that binge eaters are overweight. Of course, many are, but really many are not. And so there are binge eaters walking among us that we don't know are binge eaters. I think another myth is that binge eaters are mostly women, and they're not. there is equal representation by both men and women, and we've really only discovered that in the last maybe 15 years because they have come forward, because, it's being talked about more. I think the other myth is that bingers purge, and they don't. Bulimics purge, only binge eaters. Binge eaters binge, bulimics purge. I mean, those seem to be the top three that we find the most.
Well, one of the other ones that I thought was pretty interesting is that weight loss surgery can cure binge eating. I think that's something that a lot of people think.
Well, there's one of my favorite subjects. I think weight loss surgery is so well intended. And there's an argument to be made that for a certain small percentage of the population, and I mean small, maybe 10% of those who actually have it done, it can be life-saving if you need to lose, 400 pounds or more. But for the most part, the fantasy of thinking that if we just make the stomach smaller in one way or another, that all the urges will be gone is a myth. If you don't get to the root causes of what causes you to eat in a way that has nothing to do with hunger or physical hunger, and in a way that even offends you, you don't even want to be doing it, and you do it anyway. So if you don't get to what the root of that is, and it's not like you have some lightning bolt moment where you say, oh, that's the reason. There's a lot of reasons, but you have to get to them, and more importantly, you have to learn other coping skills so that that's not your go-to anymore. Even if you have the surgery, it doesn't stop you, and we know this because more than 75% of all bariatric surgery done in this country within 3 years winds up in complete regain of the weight that was lost and more.
Again, we're not dealing with the root cause of the problem. We're just Band-Aiding.
Exactly. And so in terms of the root causes, there are many, as we talked about, certainly psychological and family environment and addictive tendencies, and, the list goes on.
Now, Jennie, when you realize you have a problem and it may be out of control, what are the steps to healing? What can someone do to get his or her life back?
Well, I think, first of all, it depends, frankly, on where you live. What I mean by that is if you are in a metropolitan area and you have ready access to things, I think the first step is really to a psychotherapist whose specialty is any sort of disordered eating, just so that you can get evaluated and make sure that that's actually what you have and what you're doing, and to find out what the strategies are. At the same time, I think it's crucial to also be evaluated by a nutritionist or dietitian who also often treats any form of disordered eating, so that you can figure out ways that you can start to at least put that on track. Of course, it requires a team approach, so seeing your physician is always a good idea just to get an evaluation of whether there's been any physical damage done. If you're in an area where you may not have access to all of that, your first step is your doctor, because your doctor will at least, again, evaluate you medically and see if there's some kind of program in your area. Also, group community work is very important. So whether that means going to a therapy group that's specifically for binge eaters, which I think is, critical for anyone's recovery, or if you need to go to Overeaters Anonymous in your area, that's also an option. I think the 12-step program works very, very well for some people, but it doesn't quite work as well for food as it does for other substances that someone might be addicted to.
Jennie, we know the importance of sleep in our overall general good health, but you say that sleep is important to combat binge eating. Why is that?
Well, in the first place, I think most of us confuse hunger, thirst, and fatigue. And if we first ask ourselves, am I hungry, am I tired, am I fatigued, am I thirsty, you might be surprised at the answer you get. We usually think it's hungry, but we're not. The second thing is that a lack of sleep can change mood, it can increase depression, it can increase anxiety, and it absolutely slows metabolism. So if your metabolism is slowed and you're gaining weight, and you don't realize why you're gaining weight, it wouldn't be the only reason, but if that's a primary reason and you're gaining weight, you tend to feel shame, and so then you eat more to mask the shame feelings. And so it's a very vicious cycle. Sleep is critical to healing in all forms of life, but it's also critical to one's metabolism.
Jennie, very quickly before we run out of time, what can a friend or a loved one do to support a binge eater?
Well, the first thing they can do is to not tell them that their loved ones need to diet. We mean well, we love our loved ones, but when you say to someone, are you sure you want that? Are you sure you want to eat that? Don't you think you need to lose weight? All it does, no matter how well intended, is add to the shame. The best thing that a family member can do is to say, I have some concern. I'm just concerned about your health. Are you? Now, if your loved one isn't, I'm afraid to say you must back off, because until someone recognizes for themselves that they have a problem and that they need to solve it, you need to step back and just be loving and supportive and love your loved one no matter what. Because if someone goes to treatment for someone else, it will never work, and all they'll feel is more shame. So that's one of the most helpful things I think a family member can do.
The book is Overcoming Binge Eating for Dummies. Jennie, if our listeners want to get more information about you, where can they go?
Well, our website is probably the best. It's mbhany.com. That's Metro Behavioral Health Associates ny.com. We're in New York, and we serve, really people from all over the country. And our book is available on, all the major websites, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, like that.
Jennie, thank you so much for being with us today. I think this is such an important topic, and I hope that if one of our listeners sees him or herself in the information that you've presented, that he or she seeks help and perhaps saves his or her life. So thank you so much for being here.
It's our pleasure, and thanks so much for having us.
We'll be right back. It's time for this week's Medical Minutes. Joining me today is Dr. Michael Gross, the Medical Director of the Active Center for Health and Wellness, the founder of Active Orthopedics and Sports Medicine, and the Chief of Sports Medicine at Hackensack University Medical Center in Hackensack, New Jersey. Dr. Gross is the author of the new book, Get Well Soon. Welcome, Dr. Gross. Thanks for joining us today.
Joan, thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Gross, as a sports medicine physician, you've seen active people come in for treatment, and you've seen the not-so-active people. What are the risks that are associated with living a sedentary lifestyle?
Some of them are obvious. Weight gain, high blood pressure, cardiac problems. Some of them are less obvious. We now know that the number one factor that controls the progression of osteoarthritis in the knee is weight gain. So if someone can control their weight, can lose weight, they can slow the progression of arthritis in their knees. We know that 150 minutes of moderate exercise a week will decrease the incidence of certain cancers. So an active lifestyle is very important in maintaining your health and your wellness.
For someone who hasn't been active in years, does that person lose muscle and the ability? I mean, is there atrophy that goes on so that when they start to get involved in a program, they really need to rebuild a lot of what they've lost over those years?
Well, muscle weakness, atrophy, loss of coordination, loss of balance is a normal part of aging. If you've been sedentary, those problems are exacerbated. So certainly if somebody begins to exercise and is starting on an exercise program, they have to start small. But remember, we talked about 150 minutes of moderate exercise. That doesn't represent a big commitment. And that can be something as simple as taking the stairs rather than an elevator, of walking to work, of going for a walk after dinner, of doing moderate work around the house. So we're not talking about necessarily going to the gym and exercising hard for an hour and a half. That's not the picture people should have in their head.
Now, doctor, that is for an adult, but what about our children? We are raising kids today they're actually sicker than ever before. They're going to die younger, and these are kids that literally spend hours in a sedentary lifestyle playing video games on their computer. I mean, it's so much different than when we were young and we went out to play. So what can we do for our children to get them active and get them living a healthier lifestyle?
Well, I think we have to take the game controllers out of their hands. And I think we have to send them outside and make sure they do stuff. But we've become a much more organized society. The days where we used to send kids down to the park and tell them to play until dark, those days are gone. So we have to encourage kids to go out for at least an hour a day. And the NFL is very active in programs like that. All the professional athletic associations are encouraging kids to be active. And I think we have to start kids from an early age having an active, healthy lifestyle. One of the ways we can do that is by setting a good example. Not just send a kid out by themselves, but maybe get involved in an activity with them. And that will help them to get involved and get started and may make you closer to your kids as well.
Now, Dr. Gross, what about an active person? How can that person prevent injury?
I think any active person runs the risk of injury if they're overdoing their exercise. There are injuries that come from overtraining. So we have to make sure that we're doing things in a moderate fashion and we're doing them correctly. So warming up before you exercise or before you perform a sporting activity is important. Stretching is important. And then cooling down and stretching afterwards. Never doing too much 2 days in a row. Hard days and easy days prevent overtraining. So too much of a good thing is too much. You have to find the right amount, and you have to do it correctly.
What about that active person who has an injury but decides that he or she is going to tough it out? What do you say to that person?
I tell them they're crazy. That sort of thing is not a good idea. The whole idea of playing through an injury or no pain, no gain, those are concepts that are obsolete. What we know now is that injuries have to heal. When I see a kid, for example, who's athletically active and they have an injury and they feel like they have to play, they want to be there for their team, most of the kids that I see, they play sports for fun. And I remind them that it's not fun when you're playing in pain. If you let an injury get better, you can go back and perform at your best. If you keep trying to push through it, you're just going to make it worse, and you're going to probably lose the whole season. It's probably better to lose a couple of days and get better than to keep trying to push it and forfeit your whole season or possibly your whole career.
If you'd like more information, please visit activeorthopedics.com, and to learn more about how to live true wellness, get a copy of Dr. Gross's new book, Get Well Soon, which is available on Amazon.com. Dr. Gross, thank you for spending time with us today. As always, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Joan. Always a pleasure to be here.
We'll be right back. We all want to live a happy, productive life, but sometimes we just need a little help. Our Coach on Call experts provide strategies to help you live your best life now. Joining me today is Karen Chow, an author, media personality, CEO, and founder of Light My Fire, the aviation-inspired company that mentors women to fly and live outside their limits where personal freedom resides. Welcome, Karen. Thanks for joining us today.
I'm happy to be here, Joan. Thanks for having me once again.
Karen, with all of the technology we have today that makes it so much easier for us to connect, how do we know what's harmful and what's not?
The first sign, Joan, I think, is when you begin to feel as though you can't tear yourself away from the computer, the smartphone, the iPad, the quote-unquote video game. That's like the first sign of addiction. It's like painkillers or alcohol. You begin to feel numb. You lose touch with reality. Even reality TV is a form of mindless attachment. Without electronics, you feel your senses are more engaged, right? But you're slowly actually pulling away from society without even realizing it. And that's potentially very harmful because you're slowly becoming desensitized. And that's harmful.
Karen, do you think that mindful attachments are as harmful as mindless attachments?
That's a really good question, Joan. I'm going to throw in a personal experience with that also. I find that they're equally harmful in their own way, and they're both affected by societal influence. For example, here's my example. I remember the first job I ever had. I was 17. I worked at the local car belt. When I got my very first paycheck, it was paid biweekly. I went out, and guess what I bought? My very first Louis Vuitton bag. It was one of those medium-sized Speedy. That was the name of the style, right? Mm-hmm. And it was a symbol of status at the time. We're going back. I mean, it's still very status symbol right now, but I was one of the first ones that had it. Well, what was that? That was an example of mindful attachment, too. What possesses a young girl to buy something like that? It comes from a place of longing and belonging. Being status conscious at that young age is the first sign of unhealthy self-evaluation. You could say it was a societal influence, but so is mindless attachment, because mindlessly attaching yourself to a video game to the point of utter seclusion is not much healthier. You become programmed, you become roboticized, The real difference is the latter becomes an addiction and the former becomes attached to your self-esteem. So yes, they're both harmful, and I think equally.
So how does one detach mindfully from being status conscious or from addictive behavior?
It takes conscious effort and mindful consciousness. As with anything else, the first step is recognition. If you don't recognize this behavior, it becomes part of your subconscious, and eventually it becomes insidious until you lose control of your life, unable to live normally. You start spiraling downwards. So detaching from anything requires that you be in the moment. You could ask yourself why you're doing it. Are you bored? Are you lonely, sad? What's the underlying feeling that's provoking that feeling of having to grab the smartphone or the designer bag? And each day, as you learn to become more mindfully mindful, that's when you begin to undo the harm.
Karen, thank you so much for spending time with us today. If our listeners would like more information, visit KarenChow.com. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you found the show informative. At Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life, we believe that knowledge is power. Take what you've learned, apply it, and live your best life now. Remember that this information is for educational purposes only and should never replace the advice of a professional who knows your personal situation. If you'd like more information, you can visit our website, cyacyl.com. That stands for Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. While on the site, listen to past shows on demand, read the digital magazine, take part in the book club, and be sure to follow the show on Facebook and Twitter. Until next time, this is Joan Herman. Thanks for tuning in.